Hey everyone, welcome back to Watch and Carry. So, as we know, steering on the one wheel can be a little bit tricky. There's lots of different variables that come into it, everything from the rider's own anatomy, weight, the shoes they use, shifting your weight from heel side to toe side, foot placement, lots of different variables that are all important. But I just want to cover one simple thing that I keep in my mind that has really helped my riding in the last few weeks. So I'm a pretty visually oriented person, and in any sport that I play, having a visual cue really helps to translate what I'm thinking into actual physical movements of my body. So what I like to think about when steering is picturing a boat with a rudder. So you have here at the bottom, you have a boat, and then you have a rudder. Okay, and I've divided this with this dotted line here. Okay. And what I want you to think about is this part of the boat is similar to the wheel and the front foot pad or front leg of the one wheel, and also similar to the rider's right leading foot, leg, and hip. Okay, and I want you to think about the rudder of the boat, which is responsible for steering, as the rear foot pad of the one wheel, and also similar to the rider's rear leg, foot, and hip. Okay, so if you can just picture in your mind that whichever leg you use in the back is like a rudder, I think that helps to create a visual that your muscles will hopefully follow. Okay, so now let's kind of blow up this analogy with this picture here. Okay, so again, we have the boat here simulating the front leg, front foot pad and wheel, and the rear leg, and the rudder simulating the rider's rear leg and the rear foot pad of the one wheel. Okay, and you can see here that in the rudder there are different parts, right? We have this bottom portion here, and we have this top portion here. And you can see that the top portion also has these cables. And what that tells us is that there are joints between the different parts of a rudder, but the control, the part of the rudder that initiates the turn, is going to happen here, right? The rider will pull on these cables, and the direction that these different cables are pulled in will direct how the rest of this part follows. Okay, so why is that important to understand? Well, I want you to think about this top part of the rudder as your hip joint. Okay, and when you are making your turn, try to picture your hip joint as initiating that turn. Okay, for me, when I started riding, I obviously had some trouble. I had never really been skateboarding. I snowboarded here and there, but I found myself really controlling most of my turning with my feet and my ankles, almost trying to slide it forward and backward to initiate a left or a right turn. And while I could turn in that manner, I found it very difficult, had more fatigue on my muscles, and the turns weren't as smooth, and my whole leg just felt wobbly. Okay. Now, what I tend to do is I tend to picture in my mind and tell myself, okay, if I'm going to make a turn, I'm going to start here at the top. And just like the rudder, I know that if I initiate here at the hip, the rest of the leg will follow. Okay. So again, two cues that I want you to keep in your mind, two pictures, is your rear leg is a rudder, and number two, you should initiate your turn at the hip. Okay. So now, why do we want to initiate a turn at the hip? Why not initiate it here at the knees or the feet or the ankles? For many of us, moving our toes and our feet seems to be more in control than moving our hips. Well, a lot of it comes down to basic physics, okay? And I want you to take these two images into mind now, right? I want you to picture a wrench with a nut, okay? This top part of the wrench is going to be your hip joint, right here. And this bottom part of the wrench is going to be the one wheel, right here. So why do I draw it in this manner? Well, we know that in this picture, there's a wrench and it's doing work. It's trying to turn this nut. And that means that all of the demand is going to be over here. And that makes sense. When you're riding a one wheel, you're turning because you're trying to turn something of great weight beneath you, which is the one wheel. So the one wheel would be the nut. Okay. Now, if we use the nut and wrench as an analogy, if I try to turn this wrench, let's say the nut is already tight, if I try to turn it more from this part of the wrench, will it be easier or harder than me turning the nut from this part of the wrench? Well, we know from leverage, right, that the longer a lever is and the more that you apply force at a length from that nut, it's much easier to turn, right? It's much easier for me to turn that nut from here on the top versus putting my grip on the wrench here at the bottom. And that's why we want to initiate that turn on the Onewheel from the top. Okay, the Onewheel is, relatively heavy. And if we start initiating our turn here, like at the mid leg, which would be like here on the wrench, yeah, we could do it, but it would be much harder to turn all this weight than if we initiated the turn here at the hip, here at the end of the lever. And you can find that as you start to really originate your turns from the hip, it's going to be much easier for your board to turn, because now all of that force that you're applying is not only going from your hip, but it's translating to your thighs, your knees, your lower leg, your ankles, your feet. All of that is helping to do the work of turning that Onewheel. Okay, so I don't know how much that made sense to you, but again, the three things that I'm trying to convey here is, number one, your rear leg, think about it as a rudder. It's one of the main components that's responsible for steering. Number two, think about originating that turn at your hip joint, okay, at the very top, okay. And then three, what I would say is you can kind of practice this motion without your Onewheel at home. So I'm going to set up in a different room and I'll come back in. Okay, so one thing I like to do to practice that analogy of the rudder and the wrench is to kind of just, stand and use my own body and weight in my own living room. Okay, so I'm going to stand here in front of you. Now for me, I'm a traditional rider, so I ride with my left leg leading forward. So this is the front and this is the rear. This would be my rudder, my right leg. What I like to do is I like to put all my weight on my leading leg like this, and I like to suspend my rear leg, okay? And I'm going to picture myself making turns in my mind, right? So if I'm going to make a left turn, I know that I'm going to have to move this rudder in this direction, but I'm going to originate that motion at the hip. So I'm now going to move my hip in this direction to make a left turn, okay? And then I need to make a right turn. So now I'm going to move my hip in this direction, okay? These two motions, the technical word is called hip flexion and hip extension. Flexion and extension. So if I'm going to make a left turn in this direction, flexion of the hip here, a right turn, extension of the hip, okay? Flexion and extension. And you can just practice doing this, in your living room, as silly as it might sound, but just to kind of build up that muscle memory, that knowing that if you're going to make a turn, it's going to originate from the hip, because now I'm using the whole leg as a lever, and it's going to be much easier for me to use my hips to turn that heavy board than for me to start my turn here at the lower leg or there at the foot. Okay, so just some visuals to keep in mind. Once you feel that you've got that picture in your mind, in your living room, go and take it to the field, all right? Go outside. What I like to do is I like to find a wall, preferably a banister that's easy to grab onto. So that would be in front of me here. I get all my gear on, turn on my Onewheel, get on it, and then just kind of roll along that wall, okay? Put your hands here to keep your balance so you don't fall. And as you're rolling along that wall, make slight flexions in your hip and see what happens to the board. It'll start to turn to the left. And then make slight extensions to your hip, and that board will start to turn to the right. And do it more and more and more, so that way you can understand what this translates, the motion of this translates into the board actually turning, okay? So that's all I really wanted to cover in today's video. Like I said, there are many other different things to think about when it comes to turning on your Onewheel. Actually, let me go to my board really quick. Okay, we're here at my board. Besides this fundamental today, things to consider are going to be, foot placement. So here's my Onewheel. This is the front. This is the rear. So by foot placement, I mean you're going to have to consider, for example, your rear leg. Does the shoe or does your foot go here? Does it go here? Does it go like this? Does it go like that? And then, of course, the same thing would be for the front, where you would put that other shoe and how you would orient that. Other things to consider is your weight shifting from toe side, shifting to heel side, both in the rear foot and the left foot. So stance and shifting of weight are also going to play an important role. But just understanding the basics, keeping a picture in your mind, this is my rudder, the rest of this is my boat, this really helps to steer the rest of this, and that I'm going to move this heavy object by applying as much leverage as possible, using my hips to initiate that turn. So I don't know how much of that will make sense to you guys. It's quite a lot to digest, but I think the more you try to create mental images in your mind, trying to practice it in your living room, practicing it along a wall or a banister, the easier it is to build up that muscle memory. And then at some point, you're going to get to the point where you don't even think about it anymore, while riding. There are things that I'm learning right now on the Onewheel that I'm very, very shaky on, that, I'm sure in a week or two will pass that I'll think, oh, I don't even give this a second thought. And things that help me to achieve that, to get more proficient in those areas, is really just creating a mental image to clarify my mind and then applying, going outside and practicing it. So anyways, guys, if you have any other tips, please comment down below. I'm sure there's a lot more experienced riders out there. And as always, have fun, be safe, and I'll see you on the next one.